gonna whisper tonight. Tonight's not a whispering night. I don't have the energy to whisper, but I will speak softly right after I turn this off. Okay, so tonight we're gonna do another book reading. A lot of people like that, and I said that I would do that in the last video. So yeah, let's do that. So I was thinking about continuing this one here, the 1984 book, but I don't really, I won't say I don't like it. It's really interesting, but I kind of like this one better. It's interesting. It can relate to our lives. It's just really, I don't know. There's just something about it. But it's a book that I'm reading for a class. It's the second class that I've had to read the book for. And it's called The Changing World Order by Ray Dalio. And it's basically a book about how nations come to arise and how they end. Not just nations, I should say world powers. So the United States. I'm a finance major, so that's why I probably find it interesting. But, yeah, let's go ahead and crack her open. How to read this book. In writing this book, I wrestled with whether to make it complete or concise, and decided to try to make it both by holding passages to create a quick read version. If you want to read the concise version, read what is in bold, and if you want more, it's all available to you. I'm not going to read all of that, but, you get the gist. The introduction. The times ahead will be radically different from what we've experienced in our lifetimes. Though similar to many times in history, how do I know that? Because they always have been. Over the last 50 years or so, in order to handle my responsibilities well, I've needed to understand the most important factors that go into making countries and their markets succeed and fail. I learned to anticipate and handle situations that I've never faced before. I needed to study as many analogous historical cases as possible to understand the mechanics of how they transpired. They gave me the principles for dealing with them all. A few years ago, I observed the emergence of a number of big developments that happened before in my lifetime, but had occurred numerous times in history. Most importantly, I was seeing the confluence of huge debts and zero or near zero interest rates that led to massive printing of money in the world's three major reserve currencies, big political and social conflicts within countries, especially the US, due to the largest wealth, political, and values gaps in roughly a century, and the rising of a new world power, China, to challenge the existing world power, the US, and the existing world order. The most recent analogous time was the period from 1930 to 1945. This was very concerning to me. I knew that I couldn't really understand what was happening and deal with what would be coming at me unless I studied upon analogous periods, which led to the study of the rises and declines of empires, their reserve currencies, and their markets. In other words, to develop an understanding of what is happening now might happen over the next few years. I needed to study the mechanics behind similar cases in history. The 1930 to 45 period, the rise and fall of the Dutch and British empires, the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and others. I was in the midst of doing those studies when the COVID-19 pandemic struck, which was another one of those big events that never happened in my lifetime, but it happened many times before. Past pandemics, because of a part of this study, and showed everything and to me that surprising acts of nature, e.g., diseases, famines, floods, they need to be considered as possibilities because those surprising big acts of nature that rarely come along were by any measure even more impactful than the biggest depressions and wars. As I studied history, I saw that it typically transpires via relatively well-defined life cycles, like those of organisms that evolve at each generation transitions to the next. In fact, the history and future of humanity can be seen as just the aggregate of all the individual life stories evolving through time. I saw these stories flow together as one all-encompassing story from the beginning of recorded history up to this moment, with the same things happening over and over again for basically the same reasons, while still evolving. By seeing many interlinking cases evolve together, I could see the patterns and cause-effect relationships that govern them and could imagine the future based on what I learned. These events happened many times throughout history and were parts of a cycle of rises and declines of empires in most aspects of empires, aka their education levels, their levels of productivity, their levels of trade with other countries, their militaries, their currencies, and other markets. Each of these aspects or powers transpired into cycles, and they were all interrelated. For example, nations' levels of education affected their levels of productivity, which affected their levels of trade with other countries, which affected the levels of military strength required to protect trade routes, which together affected their currencies and other markets, which affected many other things. Their movements together made up the economic and political cycles that occurred over many years, e.g., a very successful empire or dynasty that could have in its cycle last 200 or 300 years. All the empires and dynasties I've studied rose and declined in a big classic big cycle that has clear markets that allow us to see where we are in it. This big cycle produces swings between 1. Peaceful and prosperous periods of great creativity and productivity that raise living standards, and a lot more. Number 2, depression, revolution, and war periods, when there is a lot of fighting over wealth and power and a lot of destruction of wealth, life, and other things we cherish. I saw that the peaceful, creative periods lasted much longer than a depression/revolution/war periods, typically by a ratio of about 5 to 1. So no one could say that the depression/revolution/war periods were transition periods between the normally peaceful/creative periods. While the peaceful/creative periods are certainly more enjoyable for most people, all those realities have their purpose for advancing evolution. So in the broader sense, they're neither good nor bad. The depression/revolution/war periods produce a lot of destruction, but like cleansing storms, they also get rid of weakness and excesses such as too much debt, and produce a new beginning in the form of return to fundamentals on a sounder footing, albeit painfully. After the conflict is resolved, it is clear who has what power, and because most people desperately want peace, there is a resolution that produces new monetary, economic, and political systems altogether. Together, a new world order and fosters the next peaceful/creative period. Within this big cycle are other cycles. For example, there are long-term debt cycles that last about 100 years and short-term debt cycles that last about 8 years. The short-term cycle also has within it longer, prosperous expansion periods that are interrupted by shorter recession periods, and within these cycles are shorter cycles, and so on. Before I get your head spinning with all this cycle stuff, The main thing I want you to convey is that when the cycles align, the tectonic plates of history shift and the lives of all people change in big ways. These shifts will sometimes be terrible and sometimes terrific. They certainly will happen in the future, and most people will fail to anticipate them. In other words, the swinging of conditions from one extreme to another in a cycle is the norm, not the exception. It was very rare. It was a very rare country in a very rare century that didn't have at least one boom, harmonious, prosperous period, and one depression, civil war, or revolutionary period. So we should expect both. Yet, most people throughout history have thought, and still think today, that the future will look like a slightly modified version of the recent past. This is because the really big boom periods and the really big bust periods, like many things, come along about once in a lifetime, and so they are surprising unless one has studied the patterns of history over many generations. Because the swings between great and terrible times tend to be far apart, the future we encounter is likely to be very different from what most people expect. For example, my dad and most of his peers who went through the Great Depression and World War II never imagined the post-world economy and economic boom because it was more different from than similar to what they had experienced. I understand why, given those experiences, they wouldn't have thought borrowing and putting their hard-earned savings into the stock market. So it's understandable so that they missed out on proof. This is written very weirdly. So it's understandable that they missed out on profiting from the boom. Similarly, I understand why, decades later, those who only experienced debt-financed booms and never experienced the depression and war would borrow a lot in order to speculate and would consider depression and war implausible. The same is true with money. Money used to be hard. It was linked to gold. After World War II, until governments made money soft, aka flat, to accommodate borrowing and prevent entities from going broke in the 1970s. As a result, most people at the time of my writing this book believed that they should borrow more, even though borrowing and debt-financed booms have historically led to depressions and internal and external conflicts. Understanding history in this way also raises questions, whose answers provide with us valuable clues on what the future will be like. For example, throughout my life, the dollar has been the world's reserve currency. Monetary policy has been an effective tool for stimulating economies, and democracy and capitalism have been widely regarded as the superior political and economic systems. Anyone who studies history can see that no system of government, no economic system, no currency, no empire lasts forever. Yet, almost everyone is surprised and ruined when they fail. Naturally, I ask myself, how would I and the people I care about, when we are entering into one of the depressions/revolutionary/war periods, and how would we know how to navigate them well? Because my professional responsibility is to preserve wealth regardless of the environment. I needed to develop an understanding and strategy that would have worked throughout history, including through these sorts of devastating times. The purpose of this book is to pass along what I learned that has helped me and that I believe might help you. I present it for your consideration. How I learned to anticipate the future by studying the past. While it might seem odd that an investment manager who is required to make an investment decision on short time frames would pay so much attention to long-term history, through my experiences, I've learned that I need this perspective. My approach isn't an academic one created for scholarly purposes. It is a very practical one that I follow in order to do my job well. The game I play requires me to understand what is likely to happen to economies better than the competition does. So I've spent roughly 50 years closely observing most major economies and their markets, as well as their political conditions, since those affect both, trying to understand what is happening well enough to I bet on it. Till I bet on it. From my years of wrestling with the markets and trying to come up with principles for doing it well, I've learned that one's ability to anticipate and deal well with the future depends on one's understanding of the cause-effect relationships that make things change. And one's ability to understand these cause-effect relationships comes from the studying of how they have changed in the past. I arrived at this approach after the painful learning that the biggest mistakes in my career came from missing big market moves that hadn't happened in my lifetime, but had happened many times before. The first of these big surprises, for me, came in 1971 when I was 22 years old and clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange as a summer job. I loved it because it was a fast-paced game of making and losing money, playing on a trading floor with people who like to have a blast with each other. So much so that traders used to have water pistol fights right on the trading floor. I was engrossed in this game of watching the big developments in the world and betting on how they would drive the markets. Sometimes it could be dramatic. On a Sunday night, August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced the U.S. would renege on its promise to allow paper dollars to be turned in for gold. As I listened to Nixon speak, I realized that the U.S. government had defaulted on a promise and that money as we know it had ceased to exist. That couldn't be good, I thought. So on Monday morning, I walked onto the floor of the exchange, expecting pandemonium as stocks took a dive. There was pandemonium, all right, but not the sort I expected. Instead of falling, the stock market jumped about 4% as the dollar plummeted. I was shocked. That's because I hadn't experienced a currency devaluation before. In the days that followed, I dug into history and saw that there were many cases of currency devaluations that had had similar effects on the stock markets. By studying further, I figured out why, and I learned something valuable that would have helped me many times in my future. It took a few more of those painful surprises to beat the realization into my head that I needed to understand all those big economic and market moves that had happened in the last 100 plus years in all major countries. In other words, if some big and important event had happened in the past, like the Great Depression, I couldn't say for sure that it would happen to me, so I had to figure out how it worked and be prepared to deal with it. Throughout my research, I saw that there were many cases of the same types of things happening, depressions, and that by studying them, just like a doctor studies many cases of a particular type of disease, I could gain a deeper understanding of how they work. I studied these through my experiences both qualitatively and quantitatively, by speaking with preeminent experts, reading great books, and digging into statistics and archives with my great research team. From that learning came a visualization of an archetypical sequence of how rises and declines in wealth and power typically happen. The archetype helps me see the cause-effect relationships that drive how these cases typically progress. With that archetypical template specified, I can study deviations from it to try to explain them. Then I put these mental models into algorithms, both to monitor conditions relative to my archetypes and to help me make decisions based on them. This process helps me refine my understanding of the cause-effect relationships to the point where I can create decision-making rules, i.e., principles for dealing with my realities, in the form of rules, in the form of if-then statements, i.e., if X happens, then make Y bet. Then I watch actual events transpire relative to that template and what we are expecting. I do these things in a very systematic way with my partners at Bridgewater Associates. I want to pause right there. Um, that's why this book isn't like, oh my god, the world is ending. It's actually a really good book where the guy actually studied past events and markets, studied a lot of things that have to do with financial academia, I guess you could say. He founded, or was one of the founders of Bridgewater Associates, which is a very large firm, financial firm in the U.S. And yeah, he's just been doing these things his entire life, and it's not like he's telling us the world is ending. He's just giving us the flat out rules for how it's happened for many nations and how every time it's happened, um, each fall has been similar in the conflicts that arise around that fall and how they lead to the fall of that empire. But I do these things in a very systematic way with my partners at Bridgewater Associates. If events are on track, we continue to bet on what typically comes next. If events start to deviate from our template, we try to understand why and course correct. I'm sorry, guys. I'm actually going to stop there. I just realized the time. But, like this book isn't as exciting per se, but the deeper we get into it, which I will just like, I've decided I am gonna make the series. The deeper we get into it, it's really interesting to see how the world goes around and just like the principles for which will govern whether or not our society can stick around. They will surprise you. They're not super hard things to grasp your head around. There's one that's kind of iffy, considering that the dollar is no longer linked directly to gold, but yeah, guys, good book. I will read this next time though, and I will make these videos into like playlists for you to go to. But yeah, I think I'm just gonna make these videos like informal. Like, my videos don't have much formality, but they have some structure. But yeah, guys, thanks for coming tonight. I hope you enjoyed, and I can't wait to see you all again. Bye.